and apologise again to people.
I call Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to use my speech to talk about three particular areas that I think are important to judge the government's performance. One is around external imbalances and looking at the challenge that Bill English set himself in order to rebalance the economy, the external accounts. The second one is around sustainability, and the third one is around inequality, which I think those three areas are good areas to judge how the government has performed. If we look at the external imbalances, Bill English rightly said that New Zealand had a major problem in its external imbalances, and essentially that is manifest in the current account deficit. And so the current account deficit is running at about 5% of GDP, or $10 billion a year. The way that we finance the current account deficit currently is that we borrow more money from overseas collectively as a country, not just the government but the whole country, and we sell assets such as land in order to cover that large current account deficit. Bill English identified this was something that needed to be dealt with, and yet what we're seeing now is that the current account deficit has become large again, and it's projected to keep growing. So keep growing up at least to 6.5% of GDP, possibly more. So on the government's own terms, which is dealing with the external imbalances in the New Zealand economy, they have failed. And that's why the government doesn't like to talk much about the external imbalances problem. If we were to just take a microcosm, if we were to look at, say, oil imports, in 2002 New Zealand spent $2 billion importing oil for transport basically, which was about 2% of GDP. In 2012 that had increased to $8 billion New Zealand dollars, or about 4% of GDP. So what we've seen is a doubling of the relative cost on the overall economy of importing oil for transport. That's why a strategy of reducing our oil dependence not only makes sense in terms of greenhouse emissions, but it also makes sense in terms of the external imbalances. We're having to spend more and more of our export earnings importing oil to pay for our transport oil costs. And according to the IMF, the International Energy Agency, you name it, oil costs over time, prices over time rather, are projected to increase. So New Zealand, as a result of the government's policies to lock us into road-based transport systems, our imports of oil are likely to increase, and that will put further pressure on our external imbalances as we have to pay for that imported oil, and more of our exports will have to be spent importing oil. That's one microcosm of where the government has got this problem fundamentally wrong. They've got it wrong in terms of the external imbalances, so we've seen a big growth in the external imbalances around oil imports for transport, but they've also got it wrong in terms of sustainability and obviously in terms of greenhouse emissions. Increasing our oil dependence increases our greenhouse emissions. Another way to look at to cut the external imbalances is to look at the dollar, the value of the New Zealand dollar, which is radically overvalued compared to other currencies. The Greens have put out various proposals around this, and the export sector and the tradable sector are speaking with one voice that the government should be intervening to lower the level of the New Zealand dollar. The options on the table are a lower official cash rate. To make that possible, we need to de-link the housing market inflation from the rest of the larger inflation issue, so that there's more space for the Reserve Bank to lower the official cash rate. That means using complementary measures to control house price inflation, which the Greens have been talking about since at least 2006 and probably earlier. There's such things as loan-to-valuation ratios, there's such things as capital adequacy ratios, which try to target housing market inflation, so enable the Reserve Bank to have a lower official cash rate because the housing market inflation is being controlled separately. The other option on the table is the use of quantitative easing, as most of our trading partners are using. They're using government-created money in order to drive down the level of their currencies in order to make their tradable sector more competitive. Most of our trading partners are doing this, and the effect is that the New Zealand dollar gets higher. We have opportunities to use quantitative easing or government-created credit in order to pay for the Christchurch rebuild. It is, of course, exactly what Japan is doing in order to pay for the rebuild after the tsunami and earthquake up there. So this is a very mainstream policy internationally. Of course, when you look at all of this together, what you realise is that we have a major problem in terms of our external imbalances, and the government has simply failed to grasp the nettle, as much as I think Bill English genuinely wanted to deal with this issue, but has failed to do so. The second area I just want to touch on is around sustainability. Climate change, there's another number of dimensions on this, but climate change is probably the right one to start with. This government has championed coal and lignite, which will, of course, has very high greenhouse emissions, and the government has lowered the price, the proper price on carbon. So by continually weakening the emissions trading scheme, it has withdrawn from binding commitments under the Kyoto 2 agreement, and of course it is subsidising fossil fuels and transport. The effect of all of that is that our greenhouse emissions, we're instead of delinking our economy from greenhouse emissions, we're actually linking it much more closely to greenhouse emissions, and that is a major problem. When you look at New Zealand and you think how vulnerable we are to drought because of a large part of our economy is agricultural, New Zealand and New Zealand primary sector has a specific interest in addressing climate change, and yet this government is doing the exact opposite. So it is undermining efforts internationally to deal with climate change, and it is reducing its own domestic efforts to deal with climate change. If we were to look at water, of course, it's a terrible story. New Zealand, under the Yale study, which the Prime Minister used to quote a lot, New Zealand has gone from the second best water quality to the 43rd best water quality under the Yale University study, so the government has now stopped quoting from the Yale University study. So whether you're looking under external imbalances in the New Zealand economy and the performance of this government, or whether you're looking in terms of the sustainability indicators like climate change or water quality, it's all going in the wrong direction, and it's all going in the wrong direction pretty rapidly. The third area I wanted to touch on was inequality. Inequality is important. It's important both economically but also, I think, morally. We have one of the most unequal societies in the OECD now, and one of the most rapidly increasing. MSD's report from August 2012 reported that New Zealand now has the highest level of inequality ever recorded, and that's happened over the course of this government. What it reported was that middle and lower income workers saw incomes fall sharply, while the top 10% saw their incomes rise sharply. And so, that was in part a result of the government's tax cuts, where the rich got a very big tax cut and the poor got virtually nothing. We've seen this big increase in inequality in New Zealand. And so that's what the MSD report found when it looked into it, the government's own report. Of course, this is reflected in the fact that we have 250,000 children living in poverty, which is a shameful statistic about our country. So when you're looking at inequality, the reason why all of this matters, aside from it just being wrong, that we have taken a strategy which has resulted in this massive inequality in our society, it also has these downstream effects. Unequal societies have more crime, they have more ill health, you have all these impacts in terms of education. More unequal societies have less movement, less social mobility, so the more unequal a society, the harder it is to move from the bottom decile to further deciles higher up. So some of the most unequal societies on the planet, such as ours or the United States, it's very difficult to move between the different decile units because the levels of inequality are so high. So having a more equal society gives people the chance to get ahead on their own efforts. Of course, this is one of the ideologies that the National Party promotes, and yet they are specifically introducing policies to stop social mobility. So it's very difficult for those at the bottom of the heap to get ahead under the kind of policies that they've introduced. So I think really after 4 years there's no more blaming the Labor government for the record of the government. Obviously the National Party has made a great deal about blaming the previous government, but I think now after 4 years we can actually look at the record and judge the government. The external imbalances have got worse under this government. Sustainability indicators have got worse under this government. Inequality has got worse under this government. So whichever particular criteria you choose to use, the government has failed. And I think that's sad for this government because there are some good people in there, but it's particularly sad for New Zealand that we've had a government which has been unable to address these critical issues for our future, and it's why we need a change of government.
Paul Goldsmith.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was very interested to hear the previous speaker talking about social mobility.